Welcome to another edition of the Magic Ladies Podcast, the podcast where we discuss everything Orlando Magic basketball. I'm your host, Jalon Dixon, and today we got a couple of things to get into. But before we get started, remember to like, comment, and subscribe for daily Orlando Magic content. We are on the road to 1,000 subscribers, so make sure you hit that post notification bell so you always know when we're dropping new videos. And let's go ahead and get right into it. Jam-packed episode for today, and unfortunately, we're starting with some bad news. Tristan da Silva snuck up on the injury report yesterday. I accidentally got a little ahead of myself. You can tell I'm a little excited about seeing the Orlando Magic back on the basketball floor after falling to the New York Knicks in the NBA Cup semifinal because I jumped the gun and said that the Orlando Magic played yesterday on the pod. That was wrong. I just hope they played yesterday. They played tonight, Thursday, December 18th, against the Denver Nuggets. Not the greatest team to go up against when you're injury-riddled. Honestly, a little rusty probably, after what is probably one of the longer layoffs that most NBA teams get, within the course of an NBA regular season. Like, this is the most that any team usually sees as far as any kind of real break in between games is this time frame for the NBA Cup. And now you tack on that there's an apparent right shoulder contusion injury being logged for Tristan da Silva, which could mean that he may miss time. Guess where they think he may have suffered it at? Against the New York Knicks. Of course they did, right? Of course, because the New York Knicks continue to find a way to press the proverbial thumb down on the scale and push the Orlando Magic to their limits without playing fair basketball. I'm just kidding. What I'm saying is it feels like every single time that the Orlando Magic play the New York Knicks, somebody comes up injured. Jalen Suggs, Franz Wagner, Paulo Banchero, and now apparently Tristan da Silva. Now, what does this mean if Tristan da Silva does actually miss time? Well, the lineup that I mentioned to you guys last episode now has to be a thing. Desmond Bane at the 1, Anthony Black at the 2, Paulo Banchero up to the 3 at small forward, Wendell Carter Jr. at the 4, and yes, despite what popular belief is for some of you guys in my comment section, I believe that Jonathan Isaac would have to be the next best player to start in that lineup. I think that when you take away Tristan da Silva, Franz Wagner, and Jalen Suggs, you are taking away so much point of attack defense. So much. And the only way to make up for the lack of talent as far as point of attack defense is concerned, because the only other players that you have that are even above average point of attack defenders left on the roster are probably just Anthony Black and to a lesser degree Desmond Bane, depending on how engaged he is. But really, you're only above average to near elite point of attack defender is Anthony Black. So you have to make up for the lack of point of attack defense on the perimeter by applying more pressure around the rim as far as shot blocking and rim protection is concerned. So how do you do that? You put Wendell Carter Jr. and Jonathan Isaac next to each other in the front court. You have another burly body and roamer type in Paulo Banchero who can kind of play center field, play like a 2-1-2 with Desmond Bane and Anthony Black at the top of the key, Paulo Banchero roaming through the middle, and you have Wendell Carter Jr. and Jonathan Isaac down on the low block. And the premise of this is you are going to dare teams to have to win scoring over Wendell Carter Jr. and Jonathan Isaac. You're going to have to dare teams, kind of similar to how those Utah Jazz teams would be so aggressive on the perimeter because they knew that they could funnel guys to Rudy Gobert, who's an elite level shot blocker and, big time rim defender. You're essentially looking at that philosophy with both Wendell Carter Jr. and Jonathan Isaac down on the low block protecting the paint. Because you have to think, who else is going to replace Tristan da Silva as far as defensive upside is concerned, right? Because don't get me wrong, I'm not going to sit here and make it sound like Tristan da Silva is some elite level perimeter defender. We're not losing OG Anunoby or something like that here, right? But what I'm saying is when it compounds of you lose 6'8", rangy wing, Tristan da Silva, 6'4", rangy, hyper-athletic point of attack defender, Jalen Suggs. 6'8", 6'9", maybe even 6'10". Franz Wagner, rangy point of attack defender type. Where else do you pull that from? We have not learned enough about Jet Howard as a defender to even remotely replace him in the lineup as far as defense is concerned. Jace Richardson is undersized. Noah Pinda is more effective as a transition player on offense than he is a defender. He's a good rebounder, but as far as defense in space, there's still a lot to be desired. Same could be said about Goga Bataza, even though I think he's very good laterally, or at least above average laterally for his size. All that to say, I think Jonathan Isaac has to start, and I don't care. I don't care if he plays 30 minutes a game. I think if you still play, I need you in this situation. We will learn a lot about the Jonathan Isaac optimist, because if in this scenario, with the injuries that have accumulated across his roster so far, if Jonathan Isaac can still find himself playing single-digit minutes, that should tell you everything you need to know about either him as a player in the viewpoint of the Orlando Magic, or there's an underlying injury situation for him that is now keeping him out of the mix as well. Because it's one thing to protect the guy from himself when he's injury prone, when you know that you have the depth to overcome that. It's another thing when this team has lost arguably three of their top 5 to 6 players, basically within the last 2 weeks. If you still cannot crack, if you're still getting coach DMPs, if you're still getting 10 minutes, 12 minutes or less in these games without Tristan da Silva, Franz Wagner, Jalen Suggs, if you're still playing less than 12 minutes a game under these circumstances, all my Jonathan Isaac apologists are going to have to really ask themselves, how much can you continue to put your trust in this guy? And I get it. I know a lot of you guys, yeah, in that the most recent win against Miami, there was the whole thing about Jonathan Isaac being like this difference maker as far as rallying the troops and stuff. Okay, that's cool. Can you produce on the floor when the team is in need? Everybody and their mama comes in my comment section and says, Jonathan Isaac, when healthy and playing on the floor, when he's on the floor, he's dang near DPOY level as a rim protector. Show me. Because without the level of point of attack defense this team has now with these injuries, rim protection has never been more important for the Orlando Magic than right now. So show me, Jonathan Isaac, please. I'm begging you, show me. Because now that Tristan da Silva might possibly miss time, this team is going to desperately need a lot. Next up, let's talk about the Orlando Magic as far as the trade deadline is concerned. I've already told you guys that I don't believe that the Orlando Magic are going to be making a bunch of moves, but it does feel like a pretty interesting thing to do over the next, month and a half or so of discussing different interesting trade candidates for the Orlando Magic, given the fact that no team is just completely out of the running to make a trade, because whether it's trying to shed salary, bring on bad contracts to be able to accumulate draft picks, or land a big fish, nothing is impossible in today's NBA. We saw Tyrese Halliburton get traded to the Sacramento Kings when nobody knew he was available. We saw Luka Doncic get traded for the Dallas Mavericks for Anthony freaking Davis. Nothing is impossible anymore. And so, of course, we're going to talk about those things. But the reality of the situation is, and shout out to Orlando Magic Daily, our good old friends over there, continue to help fuel this podcast in all ways humanly possible. And they said something that I thought really resonated. It says, but there is another goal that will likely take priority at this year's trade deadline, one that is less likely to excite fans. Orlando's main goal this February might simply be to avoid the tax and cut some payroll, delaying the inevitable tax penalties. The team can still improve even by employing this strategy, but it could lead to an underwhelming trade deadline. especially when it seems like some of the Magic competition might be far more aggressive. Talking about teams like the Miami Heat, for example, or apparently the Boston Celtics are another team that could potentially be buyers at the deadline as well. The reality of the modern NBA is that trades do not exist in a vacuum. They exist within the context of the various salary cap restrictions and planning of the team's future. And Orlando finds itself in a bit of a pickle as this year's trade deadline approaches. The Orlando Magic are slated to pay the tax for the first time in 12 years if they do not change anything. That is a distinction usually reserved for the best teams in the league. Orlando is also preparing next year to be above the first apron and all of its addended penalties with Paulo Banchero's extension kick again. That is why this season is one where the Magic are planning and aligning their tax bill more than anything else. According to Spotrac, Orlando is $5.6 million over the luxury tax line this year. That is certainly close enough to try to get under and avoid starting the repeater clock. That is really what this is all about, the repeater clock. In the NBA CBA, teams are penalized with a dollar for dollar tax for any amount over the tax line up to $5.7 million. However, they are subject to a repeater tax starting at a 3-to-1 rate if they are above the tax line for three of the previous 4 seasons. This is the important part. Orlando would like to avoid starting that clock, considering the team already has $200.2 million committed to next season, not including Jonathan Isaac's $14.5 million that's likely guaranteed salary. Next year's tax line is projected to be at $200 million. Players on the chopping block likely. The team is likely to salary dump Jet Howard's $5.5 million, but it wouldn't get them under the tax if they just straight salary dumped him. The guy with the most potential value to do so, Jonathan Isaac's $15 million contract with all its various non-guarantees. Isaac is still an excellent defender, and that should have value, but Orlando likely needs more offensive production at that salary slot. Bataze also is another player that has come up on the list, and the player that most teams would likely call about on his $8.3 million contract $8.3 million contract this season, along with having another year next season as well under on the books. So Jet Howard, Jonathan Isaac, Goga Batase. But that's the reality. To make any kind of real trade, the reality is that they're going to probably focus on trying to get under the apron. Makes sense given the circumstances. Still a very young team. Has not necessarily defined themselves as a championship contender just yet. Had to see a full season of it to see whether or not the price tag is worth, the talent that's being put out on the floor, or the talent is worth the price tag that's being paid out. The Orlando Magic are in a really interesting situation, and although, again, as the article mentions, it might not be the most exciting trade deadline for the Orlando Magic, it is very imperative that the Orlando Magic address this NBA trade deadline as such, because do you really want to pay the repeater tax for a team that might not get out of the second round at best, based off of the way things look right now? And again, I know that's pessimistic, because you're talking about the team from the perspective of it being an injured basketball team, and so on and so forth. And when they look healthy, they look decent. Granted, the last game they played was against a team that won the NBA Cup and will likely be in the mix for the Eastern Conference title in the New York Knicks. And you know, the Magic have played the Knicks well every single game so far this season, but nonetheless, it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. Right? It's just gonna be the way the Orlando Magic decide to operate will be a understanding for fans of whether or not, or a representation of fans of whether or not this is a money focused move to get their books in order, or a doubling down on this season is a make or break kind of year as far as making a push for the NBA championship, or at least an Eastern Conference Eastern Conference finals appearance, So that'll be really interesting to see. Next up, we're gonna start part one of like Lord knows how many parts, but part one of my NBA trade deadline wish list series for the Orlando Magic. And my first player on the wish list is Gershon Yabusele. Gershon Yabusele was a player that I mentioned this offseason I thought would be a very good get for a very cheap, by the way, owed only about $5 to $6 million for the New York Knicks. Very cheap, would have been an interesting replacement option if they were not able to bring back Mo Wagner. Obviously, that worked out. Would I rather have Gershon Yabusele than Tyus Jones right now? As much as I love Tyus Jones, I think the answer would be yes. Gershon has made it clear, at least, subtly in the media, that he is a bit disgruntled about his role on the New York Knicks, leaving from what was a career year for him in Philadelphia, back from coming from playing overseas just last season. And as a disgruntled player in a front court with Karl Anthony Towns, Mitchell Robinson, that guy Huck Porty as well, who's been playing relatively well for them in spot minutes. Gershon Yabusele has kind of gotten the short end of the stick, so to speak. And that's an interesting feat for me because I think that Gershon Yabusele is a floor spacing big, someone who has some real athleticism to him, and I think could be an interesting 4 or 5 on this team next to any combination of Wendell Carter Jr., or Goga Batazde, or Jonathan Isaac for that matter. I think he could be a really interesting offense and defense fit next to either of those guys in the front court. And I like Gershon Yabusele because what he brings to the table is something very different from a lot of the other guys that we have on the team, which is body mass. And I know that sounds like a very like random thing to lean into, but Gershon Yabusele simply has the build of an intimidating shot blocker down low. He's somebody that I think plays very well within his size, both offensively and defensively. And I think he's somebody that could be a really good addition to this team as more of an enforcer type, more specifically on the defensive end. But I think that offensively, his athleticism, especially around the rim, makes him a really decent finisher. I think he's a really strong screen setter. I think that his burly build gives him even more flexibility and leverage as a screen and roll operator on as the big man, tagging both offensively, defensively, again following guys in the roll, also in the roll action, being an absolute dangerous threat around the rim as a lob threat. I talked about Gershon Yabusele before the season started as a guy that I thought would be a really interesting fit in the overall rotation for the Orlando Magic. This was prior to Colin Castleton and Orlando Robinson being brought in on two ways and stuff like that, right? And I still think that Gershon Yabusele on such a cheap price point. Again, they got him for about, I think the Knicks got him for about $6 million, $5-6 million, could be a really interesting like flip piece where you're able to get somebody that just brings kind of a different overall feel. I will admit that Gershon is very similar to like what Goga Batazde is, but I think that Gershon can be a much more reliable three-point shooter than Goga Batazde to a certain degree. And I also think that the overall intimidator factor from a defensive standpoint could be something the Orlando Magic could really, really use, especially because this team needs real rim protection. And again, until Jonathan Isaac shows me that he can play more than 12 minutes a game, we have to have somebody who is a legitimate enforcer in the paint, either instead of Wendell Carter Jr. when he's not on the floor, or next to Wendell Carter Jr. in tandem, as I mentioned in the starting lineup earlier when talking about Tristan da Silva going out, to create real real paint protection to help make up for situations like this where the team is without real point of attack defenders, right? So I think that Gershon Yabusele is not a sexy name, and I didn't want to start with some outlandish name like Chris Paul or James Harden or somebody like that I honestly think could like be interesting for the Orlando Magic. We also talked about those two guys on the podcast, by the way, too, so that's another element of it as well. But I didn't want to start with somebody like that because I want to start with somebody that I feel like is both realistic, but also somebody that's come up on the podcast before as an interesting fit and somebody that I think now with the availability increasing with the December 15th date passing, and then when January 15th passes as well, that it opened the floodgates even more. Gershon Yabusele could be a very interesting piece for a very, very cheap contract. And from a financial standpoint, if you're talking about cleaning the books up, he's only signed for this year, if I'm not mistaken, which makes it where he can be an expiring contract that falls off at the end of the season. So you guys let me know in the comment section down below how you guys feel about that. Again, not the sexiest name in the world, but I think Gershon Yabusele could be a really solid fit for this team. Nonetheless, I think he could be an interesting front court rotation piece, especially if you start to kind of feel that inkling that Jonathan Isaac just cannot play more than 12 minutes a game. You need somebody to be able to take up that space. I think Goga Bataze's done a decent job of doing so. But I think if we're talking about establishing more of a defensive identity to make up for not having Jonathan Isaac on the floor as much as that backup center, I think Gershon Yabusele could be a solid pick. Last but not least, let's go to the comment section from last podcast episode. You guys were a little bit active in there, and I'm going to respond to some of the things you guys had to say. Theory. We're going to call you Theory. Theory 4686 says, I want Malik Monk or Miles Turner. Hey, I'm glad you guys love the Miles Turner pool. That was kind of a random one for me, but I also thought that was a pretty interesting, potential fit. Where, again, if Giannis Antetokounmpo is flipped, it's likely that someone like Miles Turner would get flipped as well. And I think that the Orlando Magic, again, going back to the rim protection and floor spacing standpoint, Miles Turner is probably a tier, maybe even 2 tiers above the style of player that you're getting in someone like Gershon Yabusele, which is part of the reason why I kind of gravitated to him as the first player of this series, because the first guy that threw out the pot last episode was Miles Turner, and I feel like the archetypes are relatively similar, even if Miles Turner is probably a better, more overall efficient player. Jay Wilson 3036 says, what's up, bro? Orlando native sending love from Charlotte, North Carolina. Oh, shout out to you, bro. Love seeing folks like you speaking about the Magic. Great content. I thought your Goga choice was interesting for most surprising player. Great points made. But let's be real. There's an obvious answer, and it's one Magic fans refuse to acknowledge. Can we give Wendell his flowers? Not only has he played and started in every game this season, but he's also been the best three-point shooter on the team and is statistically one of the best defensive bigs in the league. That is true. He is I believe he's in the top 15 in rebounds per game as well. He's proven to be worth every penny of the contract extension we gave him last year, and he clearly put the work in the summer to make that possible. By far the most surprising player this season. Gotta give the man his flowers. My breakdown would be like this. Most surprising, Wendell Carter. Most impressive, Anthony Black. I like that name. Most disappointing, Tyus, but dishonorable mention to Paulo. He'll turn it around, though. I'm not worried. Okay, cool. I like the Wendell Carter Jr. pool because I think, again, it all is built around your expectations. And again, coming into the season, it did feel like a lot of people were very anti-Wendell Carter Jr. as far as feeling like there needed to be some kind of upgrade. That's why we started talking about guys like a Yaka Pirtle, or I remember once upon a time Nicholas Claxton's name came up. And we had constant conversations in the comment section about the idea of needing to get a player better than Wendell Carter Jr. And similar to you, I believe that Wendell Carter Jr. deserves his flowers because going back to what I said on those very episodes, I'll say it once again. Give me a center playing better than Wendell Carter Jr. right now that the Magic can legitimately get without selling the farm, right? Anthony Davis is probably better than Wendell Carter Jr. Not probably. Anthony Davis, when healthy, is better than Wendell Carter Jr. Are you going to be able to get away with getting getting Anthony Davis without having to give up a significant asset like an Anthony Black or a Jalen Suggs or even, probably not Franz Wagner, but Jalen Suggs or Anthony Black would likely have to be in some version of a trade to go get an Anthony Davis. Is that worth it? Given Anthony Davis' injury history attached to that, despite the fact that he is a better player than Wendell Carter Jr., is it worth it? You can't get Jokic. We don't want Embiid, and even if you did want Embiid, that trade package would look ridiculous. Who's some other players that you can't get? Jared Allen would be interesting. Jared Allen would be interesting, but is Jared Allen playing that much better than Wendell Carter Jr. this season? I really don't believe so. Right? So I think it's so easy to kick Wendell Carter Jr. down because he had a bit of a down season last year. But I genuinely believe that it's harder to replace someone like Wendell Carter Jr. than many believe it is. And I'm shout out to you, bro. And as far as like Tyus as this most disappointing, that feels obvious. Most impressive. Glad to hear you say AB because AB has been balling. He's been balling. I bless M8O says Howard was drafted as a small forward 6'8". The difference between Howard Barnes OG Anunoby isn't height, it's their build, wingspan, and strength that allows Barnes and OG Anunoby to play power forward. And that's my biggest thing, right? I think my biggest thing, because my fascination with players like Harrison Barnes, for example, who's like one of my favorite role players in the NBA, former North Carolina Tar Heel, big deal. But anyway, players like that, their player build, especially in today's NBA, provides them a certain level of portability that allows them to play between the 3 and the 4, and it gives them this flexibility that now allows you to not only play offensively more than one position, but also potentially guard more than one position defensively. And I just don't necessarily know if Jet Howard is that. And I think his build is a big part of that, but I think also defensive instincts show that I don't necessarily know if he's that guy right now. I'm not saying he needs to be as good of a defender as OG Anunoby, but is he even a better defender than Harrison Barnes right now? I actually don't really think so. Next up, D'Lo Florida gave me the list of Malik Monk. We talked about him a ton on the podcast. Colin Sexton. Y'all know he was one of those interesting names that I threw out before he got traded to Charlotte. He was one of those ones. Royce O'Neal. We talked about Royce O'Neal on the podcast. This is how you know D'Lo Florida is locked in with the podcast. Shout out to you, my boy, because yes, Royce O'Neal, sneaky 37% three-point shooter for the Phoenix Suns, could be an interesting small forward, power forward, floor spacer type. And Nicholas Claxton. Also, Theory 4686 also said Nick Claxton. And maybe we'll do a little bit deeper run on Nicholas Claxton because it seems like a name that is coming up pretty decently. And we've talked about him in the past during the summer, but now we can kind of focus on it based on what we've seen from him this season. Hector Martinez says the starting lineup of Franz, Bain, I don't know, is this a lineup? Franz, Bain, Tyus, Anthony Black. Got you. So Bain has been the most impressive. Tyus has been the most disappointing, and Anthony Black has been the most surprising. Got you. My fault, Hector. I I totally agree here. I mean, I think this bar for bar was my list last time, except switching Anthony Black out for Wendell Carter. Excuse me, no, this was bar for bar my list, if I'm not mistaken, except for Goga Batazde instead of Anthony Black. So I totally get that. D'Lo Florida said Bain, Tyus, Wendell Carter Jr. So you're right there with Jay Wilson as far as having to give Wendell Carter Jr. some more love, and I mess with that heavy. So with that being said, we're gonna continue this business series again every single episode from now to the NBA trade deadline. That's what, like 30 some people, maybe, unless some breaking news or something really important comes up, right? That's like gonna be like 30 some odd people, maybe more, between now and the NBA trade deadline on February 5th. Every single episode from now, starting with Gershon Yabusele, I will have an interesting NBA trade deadline wish list player that we are going to discuss. Give me names